They say every neighborhood has a story, but some neighborhoods hide theirs so deeply that no one ever discovers the truth until it's too late. When I first began documenting the events of Merrill Pines, the quiet, polished, meticulously regulated community on the edge of Willow County, no one believed anything significant could happen there. It was the kind of place real estate brochures advertised with words like peaceful, family-friendly, secure, and highly maintained by a dedicated HOA. But if you drive past the Stone Gate today, if you look beyond the perfectly pruned hedges and spotless sidewalks, you'll feel it. A kind of silence that isn't peace, but memory. A silence that tastes of fear, regret, and something broken that can never be fixed. This story begins long before the final incident, long before the lights filled the cul-de-sac, and the neighbor stood outside whispering about who was to blame. Before the property manager disappeared, before the HOA president resigned, before the whole community was exposed in a series of interviews that would shake the county. It begins with a simple move-in day, a mild April morning, and a family who believed Merrill Pines would be their fresh start. Daniel and Amina Harper arrived at House 11B on a windy Monday afternoon. Their daughter, little Aliyah, slept in the back seat, clutching a stuffed rabbit with matted ears and faded fur. Daniel was a calm sort of man, quiet, observant, the type who read people before speaking. Amina was warm and expressive, used to big families, loud gatherings, and neighbors who felt like relatives. They weren't prepared for Merrill Pines' polished silence. When they first drove through the iron gates and the security camera tracked their car, Amina had joked, "Feels like we're entering a museum, not a neighborhood." Daniel laughed then, not knowing how prophetic her words were. I interviewed them months later, and Daniel told me he remembered the exact moment he felt something was off. It was when he lifted a box from the trunk and saw a man standing across the street, perfectly still, hands behind his back, watching them. Watching too closely. The man was tall with silver hair combed neatly backward, wearing a pale blue polo tucked into khaki pants. His shoes were spotless. He looked less like a neighbor welcoming a new family and more like a supervisor evaluating a mistake. That man was Gerald Crane, the HOA president of Merrill Pines. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply observed them for a few seconds, then entered something on a tablet in his hand before turning away. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the Cranes had been running Merrill Pines HOA for 11 years. And in those 11 years, they had turned the community into something that resembled an orderly greenhouse. The kind where plants don't grow freely, but are trimmed, shaped, and forced into perfection. Later that day, Amina recalled stepping onto their porch with a box of kitchen items when she noticed a laminated binder already placed by the front door. "Welcome to Merrill Pines," the cover read in bold, glossy letters. Inside were 134 rules, organized into sections so detailed it felt less like a homeowner guide and more like a military training manual. Rule 14. Lawn height must not exceed exactly 2.5 inches. Rule 37. Front porch decor must be neutral. Seasonal decor must be removed within 7 days after the holiday. Rule 48. Exterior modifications, including doormats, must be approved by the HOA. Rule 79. Street-facing curtains must be white or off-white. Rule 103. No children's toys may be left visible from the street. Rule 120. Trash bins may only be placed outside between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. the night before pickup. Amina flipped through the pages, her brow tightening more with each rule. "We can't even choose curtain colors?" she whispered. Daniel tried to laugh it off. "It's for uniformity," he said, though even he didn't sound convinced. The first week was silent and uneasy. Neighbors didn't introduce themselves. Instead, they observed from windows. Cameras blinked on street corners. Not the small home cameras people install for safety. No, These were industrial-grade HOA installed with mandatory 24/7 monitoring justified as security enhancements. The streets were so clean it felt unnatural, like someone scrubbed them nightly. Every lawn looked artificially perfect, too green, too even, too identical. Not a single flower dared grow beyond its designated section. But the Harpers tried to adjust. They set up Alaya's room. They planted flowers near the porch, yellow marigolds, the ones Amina loved since childhood. They placed a small, colorful rug inside the foyer, where sunlight filtered through, giving the place a sense of warmth. On their 5th day in the neighborhood, the first letter arrived. A crisp, white envelope slid under their front door, sealed with a gold HOA emblem. Inside was a printed warning. Violation Notice Number 1. Unauthorized flower arrangement. The color yellow is not approved for front yard floral display in Section B homes. Please remove immediately to maintain neighborhood uniformity. Amina stared at the notice, disbelief turning into frustration. Flowers? Seriously? Yellow flowers are a violation now? Daniel tried to calm her, but deep inside, something twisted in him too. This wasn't normal. They removed the marigolds. The next week, another letter arrived. Violation Notice Number 2. Unauthorized doormat. Wicker pattern rugs are not in compliance with HOA standards. They removed the rug. Then came the third notice. Violation Notice Number 3. Child's toy visible through window. Alaya's pink stuffed bunny had been sitting on her windowsill. They moved the bunny. That same afternoon, Daniel finally confronted the HOA office, a glass building near the neighborhood center with motion sensors and a camera above the doorway. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant. A receptionist with a rehearsed smile greeted him, but Gerald Crane stood behind her like a statue. Daniel approached, holding the 3 notices in hand. "Sir, we haven't even been here 2 weeks. Can we please talk about this? These rules are—" "Your signature is on the contract, Mr. Harper," Gerald interrupted, his voice calm but sharp. "Compliance is required from day 1. "But they're just small things. A flower color? A child's toy? You're sending notices for everything." Gerald looked at him with cold, disciplined eyes. "It's the small things that maintain the prestige of Merrill Pines. There's no flexibility?" Daniel asked, more hopeful than expectant. "None," Gerald replied. "Uniformity is non-negotiable." What Daniel didn't know at the time, what no new resident ever knew, was that Gerald Crane had been tightening his control for years. The rules were his way of shaping the community into his vision of order. A vision where individuality was a threat. A vision where deviation was disorder. A vision where exceptions were cracks, and cracks spread. The Harpers tried to comply, but the pressure didn't stop. Amina found women whispering on sidewalks and stopping when she approached. Alaya wasn't allowed to chalk on the driveway. Daniel received an email warning that his car was parked 23 centimeters too close to the neighbor's boundary line. They were invited, no, summoned to a mandatory community orientation session where residents sat in perfect rows, like students, listening to Gerald outline regulations with military precision. But the real breaking point came when the 4th notice arrived. It was early morning. Sunlight barely touched the street. Amina opened the door to find another envelope, this one larger. Inside were photographs. Photographs of their backyard. Photographs taken at night. One photo showed Daniel grilling late in the evening, violating quiet hours. Another showed Alaya's mini trampoline, visible from fence height. Another, chillingly, showed their kitchen through the back window. As Amina washed dishes, unaware someone had been watching from the darkness. At the bottom of the packet was a single sentence: "We expect better adherence to community standards." Amina's hands trembled so violently she dropped the photos. Daniel felt something inside him shift. Anger, fear, and a sinking realization that they were not being monitored. They were being hunted. But the worst part? The notice was unsigned. It wasn't just the HOA. Someone else in Merrill Pines was watching them, documenting them, waiting. And the Harpers had no idea that this was only the beginning. If you ask the residents of Cedar Ridge what changed first, whether it was the atmosphere, the people, or the rules, they'll give you different answers. But anyone who lived on that crescent before the storm will tell you the same thing. The neighborhood stopped feeling like home long before the final blow. And for many, that shift began on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning when the HOA sent out a notice that would ripple through every household like a silent earthquake. The notice was printed on thick ivory paper, stamped with the HOA crest, and delivered directly to every doorstep. At first glance, it looked almost ceremonial, like an invitation rather than an ultimatum. But those who flipped it open found themselves staring at a message that was as cold as it was commanding. The HOA was implementing a new round of community preservation regulations, rules so strict that even seasoned residents blinked in disbelief. Lawn height decreased by another half-inch. Holiday decorations limited to 2 items per household. Vehicle parking window reduced to a narrow 4-hour sliver. And perhaps most shocking, the fine for non-compliance had been raised to $500 per violation. Neighbors stepped outside almost in unison, clutching the notices, sharing glances that ranged from annoyance to outright fear. Conversations sprouted on every driveway, soft at first, then growing louder, sharper, more panicked. "This is insane," one resident murmured, waving the paper like a white flag that had caught fire. "They can't do this," another grumbled. "Who do they think they are?" "They're the HOA," someone reminded grimly. "They can do whatever they want." But among them all, nobody reacted more strongly than Elena Foster, a soft-spoken single mother who had moved into Cedar Ridge 5 years ago with her 2 children. Then, her house had always been spotless, her yard tidy, her interactions polite. She was known for her calm nature and gentle voice. But on that day, when she read the new rules under the shade of her front porch, her hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from a rising anger she hadn't felt in years. Because she knew, even before the rest of the neighborhood realized it, that these new rules were not general tightening. They were pointed, targeted, and the target was her. The harassment against Elena had started small. Notes left on her door questioning the consistency of her paint job, despite the fact that it had been approved by the HOA 3 months prior. Complaints about her children playing outside too loudly, though every other kid on the street made just as much noise. And then, 2 weeks before the new regulations hit, a photograph mailed anonymously to her home, her trash can slightly angled toward the sidewalk instead of the road. Below it, in blocky red letters, "Final warning." She had gone to the HOA office after that, trembling but composed, and asked to speak with the chairwoman, Marilyn Crane, a woman notorious for her heavy perfume, iron posture, and complete devotion to the HOA's governance. Marilyn had not offered her a seat. She had barely looked up from her paperwork. "Mrs. Crane," Elena began, her voice soft but steady, "I need to understand why I'm receiving these warnings. I've been following all the rules." Marilyn raised one hand like a traffic stop. "Mrs. Foster, the HOA enforces rules, not feelings. If you have an issue, submit a written request. That is all. But these warnings, that is all." And just like that, the conversation ended, leaving Elena standing in the doorway like a piece of furniture no one had bothered to move around. Now, with the new notice in her hand, she felt that same dismissal echoing in her chest. The tightening of the rules wasn't just policy, it was personal. She wasn't sure why, but she felt it with every fiber of her being. By noon that day, a crowd had gathered outside the HOA office. Not a mob, not yet, but a restless, murmuring knot of homeowners demanding explanations. Some clutched their notices. Some simply crossed their arms, brows furrowed, waiting for answers. A handful of younger residents streamed the scene on their phones, their captions reading things like, "HOA gone crazy? Cedar Ridge losing its mind." This is why nobody wants HOAs anymore. Inside, the board members stood like statues behind a long mahogany table, Marilyn at the center, flanked by three others who looked like they would rather be anywhere else than. The meeting that followed quickly devolved into chaos. People shouted, people cried, people pleaded, but the only voice that carried any weight in that room was Marilyn Crane's. And Marilyn said the same sentence over and over again, like a machine programmed to repeat it. These regulations are within the authority granted to the association by the contractual agreement signed by all residents. No empathy, no negotiation, no acknowledgement of the very real panic rising in the room. That meeting marked the first crack in Cedar Ridge. The pressure, the dread, the feeling of being watched. It all began coiling through every household, strangling what little peace the neighborhood had left. But it wasn't until the first fine arrived that residents realized things were about to get much, much worse. The notice landed on Elena's doorstep just 3 days later. $500. Reason: exterior non-compliance, porch lighting intensity below required lumen standard. Elena stared at the letter for a full minute before her brain caught up with her eyes. The porch light, the soft, warm bulb she'd used for years, the one that had given her children comfort when they came home after dark. Suddenly, it was grounds for financial punishment. The fine was absurd, cruel, baseless, but it was only the beginning. Within a week, 3 more fines hit her mailbox. $500, lawn edging inconsistent. $500, decorative plant exceeds allowed height. $500, vehicle tire resting 2 inches over driveway border. Each accusation more ludicrous than the last. Each one a deliberate strike. She tried to fight them. She called, she emailed, she begged. But Marilyn's responses were always the same short, clipped messages. Appeal denied. Violation confirmed. Compliance required. No explanation, no reason, just a tightening rope. Her neighbors began receiving fines too, dozens of them, often for issues they didn't even understand. But while others were being fined sporadically, inconsistently, Elena was fined every single day. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone wanted her gone. The stress began eating at her. She barely slept, her hair dulled, her cheeks hollowed. Her hands shook whenever she checked the mailbox, terrified of what she'd find. Her children noticed the shift too. Her daughter asked why they couldn't invite friends over anymore. Her son whispered if they were in trouble. Elena lied as best she could. "It's just grown-up stuff," she said softly. "It'll get better soon." But she knew it wouldn't. Not unless she did something. And so one night, after the kids were asleep, she sat at her old wooden dining table, surrounded by stacks of fines and notices, and made a decision that would alter the course of the entire neighborhood. She opened her laptop, she created a public folder, and she uploaded every document she had, every fine, every warning, every email, every message. Then she wrote a single paragraph above the files. "This is what my HOA has done to me. This is what they're doing to all of us. Tell me I'm wrong." She posted the link on the Cedar Ridge Community Forum. She went to bed. By morning, the neighborhood was on fire. Residents were furious, lighting up the forum, demanding accountability, demanding a new election, demanding Marilyn's resignation. A petition formed overnight, gathering signatures faster than anyone could track. A coalition of neighbors began planning a walkout meeting. Even the local news station contacted several residents, asking for interviews. The HOA tried to control the narrative, but it was too late. The story had spread beyond their fences. And for the first time, the power dynamic shifted. Elena thought she had finally found hope, finally found a way out of the nightmare. But she didn't know, not yet, not fully, that the HOA was about to retaliate in a way far more terrifying than fines or warnings. Because when an organization feels its authority slipping, it doesn't fall gracefully. It fights. And the HOA of Cedar Ridge was about to fight harder than anyone could have imagined. If you ask anyone who lived through the collapse of the Cedar Ridge HOA what the exact breaking point was, they'll hesitate. Not because they've forgotten, but because the memory is too loud, too raw, too tangled to summarize in a sentence. But if you force them, if you really push, they'll eventually land on the night the neighborhood meeting was called. Because that night didn't just break the HOA, it broke Cedar Ridge itself. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. The email reading, "Mandatory Community Assembly. Non-attendance will result in citation." The word mandatory hung like a threat. The word citation was the leash. But what made residents uneasy wasn't the tone. It was the speed. The HOA had never called an emergency meeting before. Not for weather, not for accidents, not even during the pandemic. Something was wrong, deeply, unmistakably wrong. By 6:45 p.m., cars lined the streets. People walked shoulder to shoulder toward the HOA building at the center of the neighborhood. It was a two-story structure of glass and oak, usually quiet, usually empty except for board meetings. But tonight, it pulsed with noise, raised voices, heavy footsteps, the sharp crack of frustration simmering into something dangerous. Multiple residents recorded everything on their phones, not because they intended to share it, but because they'd learned too many times that without proof, the HOA could twist any narrative it wanted. Inside, the air was stifling. Rows of folding chairs faced the elevated head table where the board sat rigidly, faces stone-like, eyes forward. At the center of it all sat Marilyn Crane, hands clasped, posture perfect, expression unreadable. She didn't blink when the audience filed in, not when people muttered insults under their breath, not even when someone shouted, "Resign already." She simply waited. 7 p.m. The room fell silent. Marilyn rose slowly, like a judge stepping into a sentence. Her perfume, sharp and floral, drifted through the room. "Good evening," she began. Nobody answered. "As you are aware, certain materials have been circulated online, misleading materials that have caused unnecessary unrest within our community." A wave of irritated murmurs spread through the crowd. Unrest? Unnecessary? Half the neighborhood was drowning in fines and fear. What part of it was unnecessary? Marilyn's eyes narrowed just for a second before she continued. "We are here to restore order." Two men in security shirts stepped into the room from the back entrance. The crowd stiffened. Security had never been present at HOA meetings before. Cedar Ridge was a quiet suburban community. No one had ever thought it needed guards. Yet here they were, blocking the exit. Marilyn lifted a thick packet from the table and held it up like a holy manuscript. "These," she said, "are the revised bylaws, effective immediately." Someone shouted, "You can't revise bylaws without a vote." Marilyn looked directly at the man, her stare cold, venomous. "We already did." The room erupted, voices overlapping, anger boiling, some residents rising halfway out of their seats in disbelief. Revised bylaws meant one thing. The HOA had rewritten the rules of the neighborhood without the community's consent. And if the rumors were true, those bylaws were far worse than the last set of regulations. Marilyn slammed a gavel against the table, the crack echoing like a gunshot. "Silence!" she snapped. But the crowd did not silence. Not this time, not after months of fines, humiliation, fear, harassment, and manipulation. Instead, the voices grew louder, angrier, until Marilyn leaned forward, lowering her voice to a cold whisper that somehow carried across the entire room. "Very well," she said. "If you will not listen, then you will obey." Those words were the spark. Someone shouted, "We're done obeying you." Another yelled, "You're abusing your power." A third added, "You can't control us forever." And then, from the back of the room, a trembling but clear voice rose above the chaos. It was Elena Foster. Her face was pale. Her hands shook. But her voice carried the weight of everything she had endured. "You terrorized me," Elena said. "You targeted me. I have every notice, every fine, every email. Everyone here has seen the truth. Why me, Marilyn? Why did you do it?" The room fell into stunned silence, and Marilyn, finally, for the first time, smiled. Not a kind smile, not a polite one. A thin, triumphant, chilling smile that made half the room shiver. "Because," Marilyn said softly, "you broke the rules." Elena shook her head. "What rules? I followed every guideline. You know I did." "No," Marilyn corrected. "You broke the unwritten ones." The crowd exchanged horrified glances. "Unwritten rules?" Marilyn stepped closer to the edge of the stage, leaning forward as if sharing a secret with the entire room. "You moved into Cedar Ridge alone. You didn't join the committees. You didn't attend the events. You didn't volunteer. You didn't integrate." Her smile widened. "You treated this community like a residence, not a responsibility." Gasps rippled through the room. "You punished her because she minded her own business?" a man shouted. Marilyn ignored him. "She refused to participate," she went on. "She refused to obey the spirit of Cedar Ridge, and in doing so, she set a precedent, a dangerous one." A woman rose from her seat. "That's not a rule. You can't enforce participation." "Yes," Marilyn said calmly, "I can." And then she held up the revised bylaws. "In these new rules, participation is mandatory." The room exploded. Residents surged forward, shouting. Security attempted to push them back. Someone knocked over a chair. A glass shattered. People screamed. A child in the back began crying. In the chaos, Elena stepped forward again, voice breaking. "I'm a person, not a project. You don't get to control my life. You don't get to own me." Marilyn's face twisted, rage finally cracking her controlled facade. "You are part of Cedar Ridge," she hissed, "whether you like it or not." Before anyone could respond, a loud, metallic clack echoed. The lights flickered. Then, darkness. Gasps, shuffling, panic swelling. Phones lit up like stars across the room. Security guards shouted commands that nobody could understand. And then, a piercing fire alarm scream filled the building. Strobe lights flashed red. Doors slammed shut automatically. The building entered emergency lockdown. People screamed. People pushed. People clawed toward exits that would not open. And in the flashing red light, someone saw it first. Smoke. Thin, gray, seeping through the bottom of the boardroom door. "Oh my God!" someone shouted. "Fire!" Chaos detonated. People rammed the exits. Security tried to manually override the locks, but the system wasn't responding. The fire spread with horrifying speed, like it had been waiting, as if fuel had already been placed somewhere in the building. Someone grabbed Elena's arm. "We have to get out now!" Through the rising smoke, Elena spotted Marilyn at the head table, calm, still, watching the panic with an almost peaceful expression. "Marilyn," Elena shouted, "open the doors!" Marilyn blinked slowly. "The system will unlock," she said, "when the community calms itself." "We're going to die!" Marilyn didn't move. "The rules exist for a reason," she said quietly. "Order must be restored." Elena stared in disbelief. This wasn't strictness. This wasn't control. This was madness. Smoke thickened. People coughed. Eyes burned. Coughs turned to screams. Then, a loud metallic thud, followed by another. Residents began smashing windows with chairs, desperate to escape. Glass shattered. Cold night air rushed in. People poured out through jagged openings, cutting hands and arms but escaping into the street, gasping, coughing, crying. Elena stumbled through a broken window, collapsing onto the grass outside. Her lungs burned, her head spun, but she was alive. Others weren't so lucky. She looked back at the building, flames licking through the roof, alarms blaring, smoke churning into the sky like a black storm. And there, silhouetted against the fire, stood Marilyn Crane, motionless. Watching, eyes locked on Elena. Firefighters arrived within minutes. Police, paramedics. The building collapsed 30 minutes later. The investigation lasted months. News stations covered the Cedar Ridge HOA fire as if it were a national tragedy. Dozens injured, 3 dead, 17 hospitalized. But the most shocking part? When investigators searched the remains of the HOA office, they found something buried under the collapsed stage. A steel lockbox, untouched by the fire. Inside, files on residents, surveillance logs, private communications, photographs, psychological assessments, behavior reports, threat levels, compliance scoring sheets, and on the final page of Elena's file, primary target, non-compliant, necessary removal. But Marilyn never got to explain, because she disappeared the night of the fire. Not among the victims, not among the survivors, not among the recovered remains. The last footage of her was a blurred shadow walking away from Cedar Ridge, disappearing into the tree line, as flames consumed the building behind her. To this day, they never found her, and Cedar Ridge, it stands abandoned now. Every house empty, every yard overgrown, every street silent. The HOA dissolved. Families moved away. The neighborhood became a ghost of itself. But if you drive past it late at night, some say you can still hear the faint echo of a gavel striking wood, and a cold voice whispering, "Order must be restored."